Hi, morning, folks. Sorry for the slight delay. We had some issues at the Columbia end, which has now hopefully been taken care of. So just so you know, it's nothing to do with the global classroom part. We just had some local issues. So now it's been taken care of. Morning, afternoon, evening. Today, we are going to be discussing issues of biodiversity, conservation, and how they do relate to development. And what are some of the practical issues involved? We have an extremely esteemed guest here, Dr. Karanth, who's come all the way from India. He works at the Wildlife Conservation Society, which is a globally recognized organization working on wildlife conservation in a very practical sense. And they have a global program, and he is the science advisor for the Asia program, as well as the head of India program. And he's been there for a couple of decades now. He has a PhD in wildlife biology from Florida. He began his professional life as an engineer and soon realized he just wasn't cut out to be an engineer. And then he's now actually done amazing work. And I'm hoping that you'll see some aspects of that work, because he not only is a brilliant academic, really well known for his research, but also one of those rare individuals who actually does a lot of practical policy making and impacts on the ground. And I've asked Dr. Karanth to not so much focus on SDGs, because you guys all of you have had quite a kind of a bucket load of SDGs over the last several weeks, but to really kind of focus on how do you kind of actually focus on policies and the practical impacts on the ground? What does it take to convert research into policymaking that has positive implications for, in this case, for wildlife conservation? So I'm really happy to have Dr. Karanth here. What we're going to do is, it's a pretty crowded morning session. Dr. Karanth is going to start off with a PowerPoint that gives you a kind of a sense, a broad overview. And then we're going to hopefully seamlessly, really seamlessly, that's the word, move into a video for the next, he'll speak for around 25 minutes or so, and then they'll have seamlessly move into this video for over 21 minutes and 44 seconds. And then we'll have the Google Hangout question and answer. So that would end the global classroom part for all of you out there. And then for the Columbia folks, then we'll have a short break, and then we'll come back, and then there's going to be another video also. And by the way, both of these videos can be accessed at the wcsindia.org website. And then we'll have a really kind of good round of discussions. So thank you, Dr. Karanth. So the floor is yours. Sweta, you want to walk us through?
Okay, where do I move this forward?
Okay,
all right. I'm glad to be here. I was here last fall, and I gave a presentation which was slightly different from this one. This one's shorter and has three pieces, essentially. One is about the science. I think to deliver anything real on ground, you need real science. I don't think it happens just because you're passionate or you care deeply or you are a wordsmith. None of them work. The second piece is that a lot of conservation is crisis management. It is about dealing with situations, sometimes rather drastically, so that you don't lose the natural capital itself. In this particular case, I'm talking about wildlife. But essentially, it's a series of emergency room operations. I'll talk about that. And the last piece is, in the longer time frame, what does it involve to save these kind of species and in a manner that's compatible with the aspirations of people for growth and development? And that is the third piece. This long-term piece is what will be in the video in greater detail. My talk will give an overview of all three aspects. Then the video will go a little bit into the context of Indian conservation and why certain actions are necessary. Generally, the picture of India as a crowded continent, subcontinent, snake charmers, palaces, and kings, and all that. But the reality is roughly 60% of the people are poor. They live off the land. Their energy comes from some form of biomass, and the occupations are mostly land-based. This picture captures it. I don't want to go into the figures. On top of it, we have an rapidly urbanizing India with a 300 million strong middle class, very rapid economic growth, and the two are connected. One is on top of the other. Particularly even in terms of advanced technologies. Although people constantly say that things are getting worse, actually things have gotten better. When I was born in 1948, the life expectancy was about 30. It's about 66 now, the average life expectancy. The economy is the 10th biggest in the world, close to $2 trillion. So things have changed in my lifetime. My experience of 50 years, things have changed dramatically. And this is just to set the context for where does biodiversity fit in here? Because the typical image of a Westerner is that wildlife is all in Africa, and there's, Asia is basically about ancient temples and cultures and stuff. But the fact is, because of a historical or a geologic accident 70 million years ago, when the continents broke up and pushed at each other, the Indian subcontinent pushed against the main plate of the Asian continent. As a result of this, not as a result of anything we Indians have done, we have incredible biodiversity. We have 13% of the world's birds on just 2% of the world's land area. We have 7% of the mammals. And for a country that prides itself on vegetarianism and yoga, we have 25% of the world's carnivores. Everything is there in India. This graphic captures it in some sense. We have elements of fauna from the Africa, like lion, leopard, and the hyena, which you don't associate with India. We also have the grizzly bear, the elk, and the red fox that you typically associate with North America and Europe. And we have typical Asian species too, like the rhino, the tiger, and the Asian wild dog. So all this incredible biodiversity still survives. And that's quite a miracle, because if you look at the history of US, after colonization, in fact, the first colonization by the Native Americans who crossed across Beringia, they wiped out a whole bunch of large fauna. There were elephants, cheetahs, lions in this country. And the second colonization via ships following Columbus led to an even greater wipeout, with much of this fauna being wiped out in a very short span of time, a few hundred years. Humans came into India 60,000 years ago, walked across from Africa. We still have elements of it, not a whole lot of it, but all this rich diversity still survives. And certainly one aspect of his, and the diversity is not just spectacular mammals, it's other forms of diversity, amphibians, birds. But the most difficult forms of biodiversity to protect in this crowded context are these large animals. They are full of protein, they come into conflict. This is the largest wild cattle species in the world, called the gaur. And he's not on steroids or anything. All those muscles come just from grass and bamboo. Rhinoceros, elephants, and very special adaptations. This is a species of bear that's adapted to live on termites for part of the year. Very specialized mouth structure. We have Asian wild dogs, which live in groups. We have species like the snow leopard, which are adapted to the high Himalayas. So there's a tremendous diversity there. And leopards, which are the most adaptable of the big cats with a huge range. And the species that I was interested in, I have been interested in, and my main study species is the tiger. And one of the reasons why I believe conservation has been relatively successful is the fact that of all the polytheistic religions which died off, the Greek and the various other Sumerians and others, the Hindu religion still survives. It's a polytheistic religion. It survives in a somewhat moth-eaten state, but it survives. And there is, at the core of it, a an understanding or a realization that man is a part of a wider natural community. So the idea that you need protected areas, the very Western idea that you need strictly protected habitats where animals have a right in some sense to thrive, is accepted more readily perhaps than in any other culture. So it manifests itself in very, very many different forms: old iconography, festivals, tribal art, various manifestations. This provides a foundation. But my whole point of this lecture is it's a great start. You have this rather than complete intolerance or complete acceptance of the faith that everything is designed for us, and so it's okay to use it as you want. So, but beyond that, we need a very different set of conservation measures now for us to protect what remains. The old tradition is good, but it's not going to deliver now. So when I was growing up in the 1950s, this is a landscape in the southwest of India called the Malanad landscape in the state of Karnataka. It's a 30,000 square kilometer, very rich forest area. I was interested in wildlife. I wandered in these hills, and wildlife was almost gone. Forests were being logged. There were no laws against hunting, and the little village where I grew up, tigers were shot and paraded on the streets. So that's when I really felt, let's say in the mid-50s, that I will never ever see a tiger in the wild. And this will all be gone, and my chance is to just go and see it now as it disappears. But that changed as I was a student of engineering. I read an article in the Life magazine by Dr. George Schaller, who was the first scientist to study tigers. I was fascinated by tigers. I read a lot of hunting literature, but Schaller's study was the first scientific study in a modern ecological framework, and that made me really think of switching my careers and giving up engineering eventually. It took me 15 years to do that, and become a biologist. So I ended up working for Schaller, who used to be in the Wildlife Conservation Society. And I began, what was different from the hunting lore that I had read, and Schaller's query into the life of the tiger was that he brought a very rigorous scientific framework of modern ecology. He asked questions, he used certain methods, he had data, and he moved his inference based on the results of his studies. So I wanted to take it forward from where Schaller had done his work. So by then, he had done his work in the 60s. I had started my research 25 years later. Technology had developed. So I began what was the first project in India to put radio collars and track tigers. So again, this was very interesting because these tigers have a lot of prey. One thing I forgot to mention is the bleak scenario that I saw as a teenager and the scenario where I started studying wildlife in the same landscape. There were some major events. In the late 60s, conservationists, the first generation of Indian conservationists, lobbied very hard, and they found a resonance in Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, who came to power in that window. She was quite autocratic, very effective, and had complete control over both the federal and the state governments for a period of 4 or 5 years. And she really resonated to the need for conservation. She was a very modern thinker, and she put in place very strong laws, and India has a very strong forest service which was oriented towards logging and law enforcement. The same service shifted attention to protecting nature, and suddenly from 1970s to 80, wildlife rebounded. And that was like a miracle to me. So when I got a chance to study it, I went to a site called Nagarhole, where I had first visited the forests in the mid-60s. And there was an abundance of wildlife, reasonably abundant. And I started this study, putting radio collars on tigers, tracking their lives, tranquilizing them. It was basic data, because the basic data didn't exist. How much space does a tigress require to raise her cubs? How far do they go? How often they kill? All this data, all these And there's this, incidentally, in our WCS India website, there are a lot of publications which you can access. Just send an email, you'll get the PDFs. So don't worry too much about writing stuff down. And in fact, I found the chemical communication system that tigers use is far superior to Twitter, Facebook, email, or anything we do. They just spray urine and each tiger knows who has been there, when, and they communicate in an area the size of New York City. There'll be probably a dozen tigers and they manage to socially network without any of this technology. Actually, those 6 years were fantastic. I got an entry into the life of the tiger, how a tiger makes a living, and I will just show a video, because a lot of conservation is driven by sort of a Bambi view of the tiger, saying, you know, tigers are cute, they're just like big cats and we can hug them and all. So I just want you to see this video so that you get an idea of what a tiger is, what a wild tiger is like. This was shot by a tourist in the park that I work in. Okay, so the result is this. So the point I wanted to show you the video, not to harass those of you who are very kind-hearted. It is simply to show that when we talk about managing people and these large predators in a real landscape, it poses incredible challenges. So the study also involved study of tiger food habits, how much their prey took. And the key insight from the study was actually you require 500 prey animals to support a single tiger. And this flipped the way around which this was in the 90s, and people felt tigers were going extinct or had been wiped out by direct hunting. By then also the booming Chinese economy had driven to some consumption of tiger parts. But the real solution, apparently, the real reason had been overhunting of prey by local people, which is a very different question. If you don't do these studies, you don't get the right answers. So how much space do they need? And at this point in time, India has had, I'm talking here of 90s, 20 years of successful conservation in protected areas. But the protection was seat of the pants. Managers went and stopped the poachers, but it did not involve any science. So the way they monitored success was by counting tiger tracks. This was a very native counting method developed by a senior forester, and everybody followed it like religion. It simply didn't work. You can't count tigers by just looking at tracks and saying, I can tell X from Y. So I attacked this method as a naive biologist and got clobbered by everybody saying, what do you know, this works. But then I started working on a new approach. By then, cheap camera traps, these are automated cameras that take pictures of animals that trip a sensor, had been developed. So I started working on a different technique, but a more reliable technique to count tigers involving these automated cameras. So once you put these cameras out, you get these individual tigers, and their stripe patterns are unique. You can identify them very reliably, unlike from tracks. And so I was able to develop this technique, in fact, for tigers and leopards. And we also got data on other species like the sloth bear. And this is not what I didn't like when the elephants came around my cameras. Usually the camera was left as a casualty at the end of it. So in any case, So this monitoring is what told us that the conservation was working. You had accurate numbers of tigers, accurate numbers of prey, and this is now the largest tiger monitoring project in the world. It's been going on from 86 to present day with a database of over 800 tigers in this landscape. So to me, putting that science into place is critical. And the second issue is conservation is very context dependent. If you have vast areas like North America or Canada or Brazil, you have a lot of elbow room to play around with different models. But when you come to a situation where, although you saw a lot of spectacular wildlife in those videos, it's just 4% of the land. The designated wildlife areas are 4% of India's land area. The entire area under forest, effectively under protected forest, is about 10%. And if you look at effectively protected wildlife areas, some of them are paper parks where the protection is not effective. I would say 1 to 2% area of India is strictly protected for wildlife. And so to me, it makes no sense to say that we have lots of social problems. We have, human beings in India for 50,000 years, and let's fiddle with this 2% to solve those problems. To me, if you haven't been able to fiddle and solve it in 98%, it's highly unlikely by fiddling with this 2% where wildlife has recovered in the last 50 years that you can try to solve those bigger problems of economics or gender inequality or whatever. So to me, hanging on to these protected areas is really critical, and that's why I gave the emergency room comparison. And a whole host of problems are there, like poaching. For example, although these areas are well protected, because of commercial demand and wildlife trade has now become a huge global phenomena, wiping out elephants in Africa, rhinos in Africa, and tigers in Asia. So there is certainly this issue which cannot be addressed by giving slideshows in villages. You need law enforcement to counter poachers. We have other set of problems that are coming because the country is modernizing. We are putting a huge highway systems, we are opening coal mines, and all this is actually impinging on even this 4%. And we are trying to argue that at least leave this 4% aside, but we do have these problems on an ongoing basis. So when you actually practice conservation, there's obviously the science plays a key role there, but science alone is not enough. Protection and enforcement are really critical. And then, for example, the highways and pressures, you need advocacy, you need litigation sometimes, even to go to court. Some of my conservation partners have gone to court and shut down India's largest iron ore mine. So it needs to be a package. It can't be just research or any one of these things. And with all this, you're just barely securing the 4%. But we know that this 4% alone is not enough. You need to push that to perhaps 8%, 10%, slightly larger areas for viability. And even for watershed protection and ecosystem services, just 4% is not enough. So the last piece in that mixture is how do you make more room for nature in a country with 1.2 billion people? And one of the things I learned very quickly, because I started being a conservation scientist after I had done some advocacy, after I had kind of really gone and fought some conservation battles. So to me, just publishing papers got you nowhere. So I started involving both the forestry department personnel as well as young people from the neighborhood small towns in data collection. And this is a long process. I started in 1990, but over time, it created a group of very committed individuals across the landscape. Let's say I processed about 5,000 people, and there are probably about 50 of these individuals. So it's not that everybody turns into a conservationist with the touch of a magic wand. A lot of them go away, never to come back. A lot of them can't take the heat, so to say. But some of them really became embedded in the local society, started their own NGOs and formed very, very effective pressure groups. One would know one whose uncle is a judge, the second one would know the police superintendent. You bring all your connections to these kind of battles. And some of them actually formed the core of my staff. Many of them who really wanted to be full-time wildlife biologists then became biologists. And I told them, this is not an academic research institution. If you are a biologist, you've got to interact with conservationists and make things work. Your ideas have to be pushed into implementation, often against great systemic inertia. So this means some of these people go and talk to religious leaders. They exercise a huge influence in local society. You have to talk to judges, policemen, administrators. And one of the big problems is even this 4% area, which is already earmarked for conservation, has human settlements. And often these tend to be people from the lowest social strata who are dominated. India has a very strong caste system where the upper caste dominate the lower caste, somewhat reminiscent of the southern part of this country a century ago. It still survives this sort of a social disparity. So these people are caught in a bind. Rest of India is progressing, but they are in the middle, but they're afraid to go out. So the second problem this poses is huge conflict. If you raise rice paddies in the middle of elephants, we have elephant densities of 1 elephant per square kilometer. It's a huge problem. Elephants do raid crops and damage. So we started working on convincing people to move out. Government had a policy. The policy wasn't working too well. But we said, as a conservation group, we will work with you to make sure you get the best deal possible and you're better off than you are inside. It's a very slow process. It took 10 to 15 years typically to negotiate with a group or a family. But over time, we have gotten involved in this. The second video will get more into that. So I started as an engineer, became a tiger biologist, and I do all this stuff now. So it's all a part of the portfolio. But in the end, I come back to the science because we have numerous examples. I'm sure in the Millennium Development, there's a lot of this goes on where you throw money at problems by the millions and billions, and you don't have a metric of success. In conservation, the only metric of success is what's happening to the wildlife. In health, it could be improved healthcare. In nutrition, it could be somebody is better fed. But for us to measure our success with how much money is spent, are people happy? No, that's not the metric I want. So we still have a very strong monitoring system in place, which shows that the tiger numbers are doing well and in fact going up in different parks. The model seems to be, it's in staggered. We started in some parks earlier. It seems to be working well. And we also, as a part of the process, I felt that well-trained conservation professionals are really required, and we started a master's degree program in India using many of us who are trained in the West who are parked back there, and it's a very unique program. It's a 2-year master's in wildlife biology that Tata Institute of Fundamental Research and WCS jointly teach in Bangalore, and it's produced a lot of good students who are now active. We have produced 75 students so far. Some are doing PhD, some have done PhD, some are running conservation NGOs. So it's creating a new generation of leaders. And they are working everywhere. So I showed you mostly the work that I have done, but now they're kind of working in different parts of India where different models of conservation are needed. So in summary, there's a large body of conservationists in India. I would even say a majority of conservationists are sort of giving up hope. They say that this growth, development, these are all going to destroy everything and we can only wring our hands in frustration and try to hold. I have a slightly different view. I think one of the readings that Shiv gave you, that series of debates that John Robinson had with the other 3 guys, I think it captures that. I think we cannot deny technology. We cannot say growth is not needed because that's what people have voted for. In my lifetime, I've seen 3 experiences. First was Mahatma Gandhi, who wanted people to live a humble, simple life in mud huts, and people of India said no and moved on. And Mao did the same thing in China in 60s, and Chinese said no and moved on to Dong Xiaoping and all the progress. And in this country, the hippies, my generation, long hair, guitar, all that's turned into a business, complete business. So this business of renunciation, I don't see as a logical solution to it. I think we have to have growth combined with equity. It's how you manage the landscapes. In some places, I strongly believe in John's argument that some places need to be protected strictly for biodiversity. There's a larger landscape where you probably can have some human use and some conservation and agriculture, and some areas which should be earmarked for intensive agricultural industrial production. I do believe that really holds the key. So this is a site I saw in May 1994. And this is a site that I want my granddaughter to keep seeing in the years to come. Thanks. So you are now going on to the video, right? The next video kind of gets into the issue of relocation and how to make it work. But I want to clarify that relocation is not a solution everywhere. It's a solution for a particular context like India or Bangladesh, or where you have very high human densities, very high economic growth, other opportunities exist. So it's not a panacea, but it's a key piece where a lot of the world will get to where India is now. So I think it's an interesting idea.
From its small beginning as a one-man tribal research project in the 1980s, the Dungeons invested in Melbourne as most of multifaceted research and conservation issues under the leadership of veteran wildlife scientist Dr. Karanth. Applying the use of breeding telemetry to study Indian tigers, Karanth was also well of devising an innovative scientific technique for counting using camera sounds. This is good enough. A king of Burma, who used to live inside a nature reserve or something. One day, by nothing forced to live alive, he had a horrible encounter with one of the most dreaded animals in the jungle, a soft bear. This is very unusual. A farm used to cultivate inside the reserve. Many months of life, he was in drives along his streets, animals in the surrounding ground compared themselves to his rainbow. Science being the second most populous nation in the world, over 1.2 billion. India is also one of the most biologically rich countries. It's always following the law for birds, wildfires, and nature animals. If these are
How does it? It comes up here. This is from outside.
These folks as well as outside.
Okay.
So to select the question, just click select,
Okay.
and then it selects. So this is the first question. And then when you're done, just click done.
Okay.
Then it disappears.
Yeah, and then
I have to go through all of them.
As much as you'd like. You can read out the questions aloud. Do you want me to read it out?
Yeah, why don't you?
What are the, this is from Madagascar. What are the indicators that will allow us to prove that the preservation of biodiversity is a key guarantor or the access to sustainable development? What are the indicators that will allow us to prove preservation of biodiversity is a guarantee sustainable development?
That's a complicated one. I'm not sure if anything guarantees sustainable development because, but the key indicators have to be rooted in biodiversity. It can't be how much money you spent or, you know, how many people are better off. I think direct metrics of biodiversity recovery are needed.
Okay. Second one, illicit exportation, illicit exports is practiced everywhere because in the international market, the demand of the customers is very important. How to enforce people, I guess, what do you do with, in this case, wildlife trade? How do you counter wildlife trade?
I think there are both regulatory in the sense actual strong. I think there are two pieces to this. A lot of the trade happens once the wildlife leaves the protected areas in the context of India. So enforcement inside actually prevents trade. So that's really critical. The second piece that helps that enforcement is working with the local communities, because not all are criminals. A lot of them are then become your allies if they are incentivized. At an international level, we find that whether pressure works or not depends on the country, its economic status, how much foreign aid it gets, how much influence Western countries have. So this is a huge variable, and there's no one rule. But one of the interesting things is China has been a real driver of this trade. We have been working in China for many years. We are beginning to see that the new generation of Chinese who have grown up in urban environments are themselves now beginning to sort of understand the negative consequences. And I think some internal pressure is going to be generated. I think if it's large countries like India, China, Russia, there is very little foreign pressure can do. I think the motivation has to come from inside.
Okay. Oh, this one popped up. You want to read it? How to reinforce commitment of multinational companies to corporate accountability for environmental crimes in developing countries. Public-private partnerships be effective and efficient.
I would say that whether they are multinationals or government-owned enterprises, social pressure is one way to ensure good behavior. And I've seen a lot of public sector, publicly owned socialist enterprises in India doing dreadful things like the mine that I talked about. So it's not a phenomenon restricted to multinationals. I think social pressure, free open society and media are critical, and opportunity to litigate.
Okay. One more. Loss of our planet's biodiversity could lead to the 6th great extinction, and ecosystems have huge effects on climate regulation. Would it be too drastic to raise biodiversity protection to a first order of importance in addressing sustainable development? By Judy.
Well, I think there are all these international lists of pious good wishes. I actually don't know whether raising it will help. One of the things I worry about some of these very structured international approaches is, for example, Global Environment Facility put tigers way high up and dumped a ton of money into some 5 Indian reserves in 1990s, and the results were terrible, because when you throw a lot of money at a small place, a lot of corrupt people come there and it causes more damage. I think we need to be more nuanced. And secondly, we need to make sure what works. I think too many of the international solutions are kind of log frames, structured, and you do it, results come. I don't think that works. I think we got to be more nuanced and more science-based.
See, as you know, Dr. Karanth doesn't hold any punches. This is done. Okay. Do you think the reduced emission for deforestation degradation plus REDD plus, a RED plus program is viable and sustainable way of conserving forests worldwide? So payment for ecosystem services and so on.
Look, this is really not my area of expertise, but my generic take on this is, if the payments are very large and the countries, the national governments step into the picture and take it first and then try to distribute it, the fraction reaching the real beneficiary would be very small. This is my suspicion, but I'm not an expert in this.
Okay. Another one. Considering that already some biological species have been lost, what can we do to protect species that are in danger of extinction? Well, I guess the talk today was about that. How can we protect other species to reach in danger of extinction? So could you give some other examples?
Yeah, I think there are two things. Today I made a very strong pitch for one approach, which was very focused on India, but I think increasingly in Africa and other places also, we do need special protected areas. I don't think you can wipe away the boundary and expect things to survive. So a renewed commitment to protected areas that was there in the 70s is certainly required. But that's not all. I think one of the new things that's happening is in many places, I'm not saying everywhere, wildlife is actually coming back outside these protected areas. It's happening in Europe, where lynx and wolves are coming back. It's happening in India, where leopards are now found everywhere. The numbers have shot up. So this actually is creating more habitat, non-traditional habitat, which is not natural habitat, highly modified habitat, where a variety of species can exist. So this is a new situation which needs careful study and fixing of these problems. So I think basically protected areas and promoting tolerance and coexistence through some rational measures outside the protected areas are the two things you can do to prevent. The third thing, of course, is trade or any form of exploitation. I don't think solutions based on exploitation will work for wildlife.
Oh, you don't believe in sustainable exploitation?
Well, we have had domestication of the wild water buffalo thousands of years ago. Today, there's a single wild population left in India that's kind of intact. I don't think because we farm buffaloes, the wild ones are protected. I don't think it's working for tigers in China. In fact, I'm now hearing that with the international pressure and things, the Chinese are thinking of shutting down the tiger farms in the long run. So I'm not convinced that that's a way to save endangered species, although there may be a reason for raising species. I'm not against farm animals. All I'm saying is it's a highly unlikely solution for some of these endangered species.
Okay, so now from Aishwarya, the class here. Biodiversity and conservation are being used interchangeably, but many popular endangered species, tiger elephants, are the focus of most conservation activities at the cost of others. Lion-tailed macaque. Is biodiversity maintenance then a possibility?
That's a very good question. It's a question of what gets people to act. So I think the species approach has been phenomenally successful across the world because a species resonates with the culture or with the bureaucracy. Now, obviously, you could, for example, use iconic species like the snow leopard, and that would save a set of species. You could focus on the tiger or the elephants, which have religious connotations, to save some other species. So I think a careful choice of species, because many of these species are umbrella species. So it does, to me, in practice, work really well. Whereas if you use purely informatics and how many species, species richness indices, Shannon-Weiner and stuff like that, doesn't get people to do anything about it. So it kind of becomes an academic exercise. So I am very strongly in favor of species approaches, but with a careful choice of species so that these umbrella species capture whatever else you want to save.
Okay. What is the difference between conservation and preservation? Again, from this class, which approach do you think is better to achieve sustainable development?
No, conservation is a broader definition which includes preservation. The kind of protected areas I talked about, that's really more of the preservation sense. But conservation also means, in the case of fisheries and things, actually using the resource. Conservation also means, in some cases, shooting man-eating tigers or a species that's become a pest or a great economic cost is being imposed. So conservation involves use, preservation, as well as damage control, whereas preservation is one subset of that.
Okay. Another popular number 10 coming up. What is your view of, again from this class, of the argument offered by certain hunters that they are conservationists? That is, they argue they have a vested interest in ensuring that wildlife populations do not go to zero.
The history of conservation has been, early history was all rooted in hunting. Even in India, the initial phase that I talked about from the 70s to 80s, people who promoted it like Dr. Salim Ali and many others were actually hunters. So, and in US, there's a tremendous history of legislation, funding through hunting, etc. Now, I don't think you can have one answer to this question. In Africa, in many places, hunting has actually led to increase of wildlife in some circumstances. So I don't think there's a generic answer to it. So hunting could do good in some circumstances. Hunting does do damage in some other causes, other contexts. So it's very hard to give a definite answer to this.
Yeah, but hunting was not good for Cecile the lion.
It was good for a lot of people who made a living off Cecile.
Yeah, Cecile, yeah, tens of thousands of dollars. Okay, so now another one. How do we decrease practices such as poaching and increase participation in sustainable biodiversity practices from all community members?
I think an element of compulsion is required. I don't think it will just happen because you go and convince every individual. Because what happens in a typical society where there's a private gain to be made by an individual, a small section of the people are enough to heavily impact biodiversity. For example, in our landscape, right now, the number of people who actually actively go and hunt is very small. But if there is no enforcement, they would take out everything. So that enforcement part is important, but enforcement is not alone enough. I think one of the keys is to really educate people, educate in a sense, in a deeper sense, that all this is valuable, all this is of value. People, even the poorest of people, stand in long queues in India and even donate blood to go and see some stupid movie star and his latest film. So that comes from not economic motive, something deeper drives it. I think this sort of social education at the level, building on the fascination kids actually have for nature, which we kill through our schooling system. I think that's really a long-term matrix on which this enforcement has to sit.
All right, so we'll just take two more. These are the last two. Okay, this is environmental/ecological research tends to be very labor-intensive and time-consuming. How can environmental data collection be adapted so that more data is available quickly for policymakers?
Well, I think some of the data can be collected quickly, mostly the remotely sensed data, etc. But some of the other kinds of data, like the data I talked about numbers of prey animals, etc., it's impossible to collect remotely. You got to be on the ground collecting data. So that, but to me, data collection need not be restricted to one scientist. I think a lot of people like to go out there, watch nature, and we built a citizen science model in India. There's a paper by Mackenzie Johnson on it. I'll send it, as to how you can use citizen science in a way as an educational tool, as well as collect the kind of data that cannot be collected remotely. And the ecologists have another problem. They go on collecting data and don't analyze or make smart decisions easily with it. So sometimes collecting data becomes an excuse for not acting. I think that's something we need to guard against also.
I think, yeah, at Columbia, we specialize in that. The very last one, John here. How can boundaries of new nature reserves be drawn inclusively with an eye towards the rural poor who lack a voice in environmental policy, otherwise need to be relocated?
Well, I think the boundaries have to be ecologically defensible. I would certainly say that, having a boundary that is disputed and not accepted, and that is endless litigation and conflict. But beyond that, clearly some areas have to be excluded. I think one of the problems is we have development unfolding everywhere, and it is a magnet for people. And I think we need to leverage the power of development rather than expect people to remain frozen in time for centuries, particularly with population densities increasing.
Okay, so now for all of you, not at Columbia. This is goodbye time. I'd like to thank Dr. Karanth. See, all these, the last several weeks, we have had kind of very interesting exchanges on how do you have sustainable development, which primarily boils down to three things: socially inclusive, economically kind of vibrant, productive, and environmentally sustainable solutions. And there always has been a sense that for, if not for all, at least for most situations, you can have all three. But I think Dr. Karanth, through his research and also some of the readings, for example, the Robinson Exchange, shows that, look, we need to establish priorities and trade-offs. You can't really have kind of win-win-win across the three for everyone. If you do that, the quality of environment, quality of economic growth, and kind of social inclusion may all suffer. And in this case, clearly, the biodiversity in terms of wild animals are going to be kind of losers. So you cannot have everywhere the concept of sustainable development as a win for everyone, for all, not just human beings, not just anthropocentric, but for ecology. It's simply not possible, especially in crowded landscapes. And we know that more and more parts of the world are becoming crowded. One thing is to have population density, is quite another thing to have, because of globalized market system, impact of this market in distant landscapes that may not be crowded. And that too is equally devastating. So we need to be careful in the way we frame what is sustainable development. We need to be upfront about our kind of, if it's biased towards the rural poor, we need to say, okay, what in the long term would benefit them? But we need to be very clear what would be what are we kind of trading off with, and not just have this kind of rosy picture that many environmentalists have, that, oh, in this case, let the poor be there in the rural areas. They hardly have extracting any kind of biomass, and they live in harmony with nature. Okay, that much research, much data has gone to show that that simply doesn't work. And I think Dr. Karanth, even though he has not pulled any punches, hasn't really discussed another important aspect, which is the political economy of why this kind of work is so difficult to do. Why it is really difficult to actually, for example, locate people. That's because there are very real interests of environmental NGOs, of other people who have a strong interest in making sure that you do have these villages kind of stuck in the wilderness. So there are kind of political economies of a different magnitude also at work. And part of his work and part of the group's work has been to challenge that and kind of counter that through kind of the policy making mechanisms, approaching a politician. So that's another whole area that he hasn't really kind of spoken about, but kind of really brilliant work, very practice kind of oriented. So I'd want to thank Dr. Karanth and the rest of you for some really remarkable questions. Sorry we couldn't take up some of these other many questions that are kind of now scrolling up. So goodbye and good luck.